In 2012, a 91-year-old woman died quietly in an Istanbul hospital. She had no throne, no palace, no servants. Yet when her funeral procession moved through the streets, thousands gathered to weep for her. Why? Because Fatma Neslişah Sultan was the last living bridge to an empire that once ruled 3 continents, and her life contained more tragedy, exile, and impossible resilience than any Hollywood screenplay could invent. She was born into a world of golden ceilings and whispered conspiracies. She would die in a country that had once forbidden her to exist. This is her story. Picture Constantinople in the spring of 1921. The Ottoman Empire is dying. Everyone knows it. The city that had defied armies for 500 years now crawls with foreign soldiers, British, French, Italian, their boots echoing through streets where sultans once rode in triumph. In the great palaces along the Bosphorus, the imperial family waits. They don't know what's coming. But something is coming. And in the middle of this collapse, a baby girl arrives. Fatma Neslişah was born on February 4, 1921, in the Nişantaşı Palace. Her grandfather was Mehmed VI, the 36th and final reigning sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Her other grandfather was Abbas Hilmi II, the last Khedive of Egypt. Think about that for a moment. This infant girl carried the blood of 2 of the most powerful dynasties in the Islamic world. She was, quite literally, born to rule. But rule what? The empire her ancestors had built. An empire that had lasted 6 centuries, that had conquered Constantinople when it was still called that name, that had besieged Vienna and controlled the holiest sites of 3 religions, was crumbling around her crib. She would have no memory of its glory, only its end. Her early childhood was a strange twilight existence. The imperial family still maintained their rituals, their protocols, their elaborate court etiquette. Servants still bowed, titles were still used, but everyone could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was building a new nation from the ashes of the old, and that nation had no room for sultans. In 1922, the sultanate was abolished. Fatma Neslişah was 1 year old. Her grandfather Mehmed VI fled Constantinople aboard a British warship, the HMS Malaya, carrying little more than his personal belongings and a handful of servants. The man who had been commander of the faithful, shadow of God on earth, custodian of the 2 holy mosques, left his empire like a thief in the night. He would die in exile 4 years later in San Remo, Italy, and be buried in Damascus. But little Neslişah remained. For 2 more years, the imperial family clung to Constantinople, hoping perhaps that the storm would pass. It didn't. On March 3, 1924, the Turkish Grand National Assembly passed a law that would shatter countless lives. All members of the Ottoman dynasty, every prince, princess, consort, and child, were to leave Turkey within 10 days. 10 days to abandon the only home they had ever known. 10 days to become refugees. Fatma Neslişah was 3 years old. Imagine that scene for a moment. The scramble to pack centuries of possessions into suitcases. The desperate attempts to convert jewelry into cash. The tearful goodbyes to servants who could not follow. And the children. So many children. Being bundled onto trains and boats. Not understanding why they had to leave, where they were going, or if they would ever return. The dynasty scattered across the world. Some went to France, some to Egypt, some to the Balkans or the Middle East. They took different names, learned different languages, found different ways to survive. Princes became taxi drivers. Princesses became seamstresses. The descendants of Suleiman the Magnificent worked in shops and factories, hiding who they were. Neslişah was luckier than most. Her family had connections to Egyptian royalty. Remember, her maternal grandfather was the former Khedive, and so she grew up in relative comfort in Cairo and Nice. But comfort is not the same as home, and she never forgot that she was in exile. She received an excellent education, learning French and English, studying music and literature. By all accounts, she was intelligent, dignified, and possessed of that ineffable quality that people call presence. Those who met her said you could feel immediately that she was someone, that she carried something ancient in her bearing. In 1940, she married Prince Muhammad Abdelmonem, the son of the last Khedive. It was a union of 2 displaced dynasties, 2 families who understood what it meant to lose everything. They would have 2 children together, but history wasn't finished with her yet. In 1952, the Egyptian Revolution overthrew King Farouk. Once again, Neslişah found herself on the wrong side of history, married into a dynasty that had just been erased. The family's property was confiscated. They became exiles again. Think about the cruelty of that pattern. She had already lost one empire as a child. Now, as a grown woman with children of her own, she lost another. Some people are just born under a certain star. She and her husband eventually separated, and Neslişah moved to France. For years, she lived quietly in Paris and Nice, a princess without a principality, maintaining her dignity in reduced circumstances. She gave occasional interviews. She preserved what documents and photographs she could. She became a living archive of a vanished world. And then, slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Turkey started to remember. Did you know that the law exiling the Ottoman dynasty remained in effect for decades? Female members were allowed to return in 1952, but men had to wait until 1974. Imagine being forbidden from your homeland for 50 years simply because of who your great-grandfather was. Neslişah first returned to Turkey in 1952, and the experience was overwhelming. She visited the palaces where her family had lived, now converted into museums. She walked through rooms where her grandparents had held court. Everything was the same: the gilt, the crystal, the views of the Bosphorus. And everything was different. She was a tourist in her own history, but she kept returning. And each time, she noticed something changing. The Turkish public began to see the Ottomans differently, not as the corrupt backward rulers that early Republican ideology had portrayed, but as a complex dynasty that had built something extraordinary. Nostalgia crept in, then fascination, then something approaching pride, and Neslişah became the symbol of that shift. She moved back to Istanbul permanently in the 1990s, taking an apartment in the city her family had ruled. By then, she was in her 70s, a graceful elderly woman who still carried herself like royalty. Journalists sought her out. Historians consulted her. She became a link to a past that Turkey was finally ready to reclaim. Her greatest revelation, the moment that truly cemented her place in Turkish hearts, came in her final years. When asked about the exile, about the suffering, about the injustice of it all, she refused bitterness. "Turkey is my homeland," she said. "Whatever happened, my love for this country never diminished." She had every right to be angry, every right to resent the nation that had expelled her family like criminals. Instead, she chose grace. Did you know that when Neslişah finally returned to live in Istanbul, she would sometimes visit Topkapı Palace and stand before the treasury, looking at the jewels and artifacts that had once belonged to her ancestors? Visitors would pass by without knowing who she was. The irony was almost unbearable, and somehow perfect. The last Ottoman princess, anonymous among tourists, gazing at her own inheritance behind glass. She became close friends with various Turkish intellectuals and politicians. She attended ceremonies and cultural events. She was a living reminder that history is not just dates and battles, but people. People who loved and lost and somehow kept going. When she died on April 2, 2012, Turkey mourned as if it had lost one of its own. Because it had. Her funeral was held at the Sultanate Mosque, a stone's throw from the palaces where her family had reigned. Thousands attended. Turkish television covered the event live. She was buried in Istanbul in the Sultan's Cemetery in Eyüp, the first member of the Ottoman dynasty to be buried in Turkish soil since 1924. It had taken 88 years, but she had finally come home to stay. The Ottoman Empire lasted from 1299 to 1922, 623 years. Fatma Neslişah's life spanned only 91 of those years, all of them after the empire's end. Yet in many ways, she embodied its legacy more completely than any sultan. She knew what it meant to lose everything and rebuild, to be cast out and return with dignity, to represent something larger than herself. There's something almost mythological about her story. The princess born at the twilight of empire, the child cast into exile, the woman who wandered through decades of displacement, and finally, the return home, not in triumph, but in quiet grace. It's the oldest story in the world, and it happened in our lifetime. Here's what I keep thinking about. Neslişah could have been bitter. She could have spent her life demanding restoration, raging against injustice, nursing grievances. No one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose to preserve and dignify what remained. She chose to be a bridge rather than a wall. In a world that often encourages us to hold on to our angers, to define ourselves by what was taken from us, her example offers something different. So let me ask you this. What does it mean to lose your entire world and still love it? Neslişah lost 2 empires, saw her family scattered across continents, and spent most of her life as an exile. Yet she came back. She forgave. She found a way to belong again. Maybe that's the most Ottoman thing of all. Not the conquest, not the gold, not the endless expansion, but the resilience, the insistence on dignity despite everything. What do you think? Was her forgiveness a sign of wisdom or naivety? Could you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. And if you're still here, thank you. These stories deserve to be remembered.